Hey guys, tonight we're going to dim the lights, settle into our coziest blankets, and take a long, slow drift back to the Wild West. But we're not focusing on the shootouts, the dusty trails, or the stoic sheriffs. No. Tonight, we're diving into the culinary underbelly, the greasy, often questionable world of what folks actually ate and drank in those iconic saloons. Because, let's be real, while the Cowboys and Outlaws were busy making history, their stomachs were probably rumbling for something a little more substantial than a dramatic monologue. So lean back, close your eyes if you want, and let's gently peel back the layers of myth and bravado to uncover the truly fascinating, and sometimes stomach-churning, reality of saloon fare. We're not looking for high drama here, just a calm, meandering journey through the menus of yesteryear. You might even find yourself drifting off before we get to the questionable oysters. A culinary journey through dust and debt. Alright, let's start with the most iconic of all Wild West establishments, the saloon. Now, when you picture a saloon, you're probably thinking of swinging doors, a long polished bar, a piano player in the corner, and maybe a few card games going on. And you'd be right, mostly. But what you might not be picturing is the waft of stale beer mixed with, well, something vaguely meaty and certainly not fresh. Because while saloons were the social hubs, the places where fortunes were made and lost, reputations built and shattered, they were also often the primary source of a square meal for many a weary traveler or local ruffian. Now, it wasn't exactly fine dining, of course. Unless your idea of fine dining involves a healthy dose of dust and the constant risk of getting into a brawl over a disputed poker hand. The food served in these establishments was, by necessity, practical. It needed to be relatively cheap to produce, easy to store, and filling enough to keep a man going, whether he was heading out on the range or just trying to forget his troubles at the bottom of a whiskey glass. So, what exactly was on the menu? Well, it varied wildly depending on the saloon's location, its proprietor's ambition, and, let's be honest, the general level of desperation in the area. But there were some staples, some recurring themes in the culinary landscape of the American frontier. Let's begin with the most famous, or perhaps infamous, offering, the free lunch. Ah, the free lunch. It sounds like a dream, doesn't it? Walk into a saloon, order a drink, and bam! A spread of deliciousness awaits, all on the house. Except, as with most things that sound too good to be true, there was a catch. Or several catches, really. The free lunch was a marketing ploy, pure and simple. The idea was to draw customers in. You'd come for the free food, and then, naturally, you'd feel compelled to buy a drink. Or several drinks. Because, let's face it, that free food was usually quite salty. Very salty. We're talking about a salt content that would make a modern nutritionist faint clean away. Why salty? Well, because salt makes you thirsty, and thirsty customers buy more beer and whiskey. It was a brilliant, if slightly dehydrating, business model. What did this free lunch typically consist of? Often, it was cured meats. Think pickled eggs, perhaps some questionable sausages, or salted ham. Sometimes you'd get a bowl of pretzels or crackers, again, all designed to encourage maximum liquid consumption. If you were lucky, and by lucky, I mean the saloon owner was feeling particularly generous or competitive, you might even get some cheese. But don't expect anything fancy, like a nice brie. We're talking about hard, often dry, cheese that could probably double as a weapon in a pinch. Vegetables were a rarity, unless they were also pickled. Fresh produce was a luxury in many frontier towns, especially those not near a reliable water source or farming community. So, a side salad? Forget about it. A garnish of parsley? That's a laugh. Your greens were probably whatever wild weeds someone managed to forage, if you were really pushing it. And even then, they weren't showing up on the free lunch spread. The quality of this free fare also varied wildly. Some saloons prided themselves on offering a decent spread, knowing that a reputation for good, or at least edible, free food could bring in more paying customers for the drinks. Others were just trying to get by. And in those cases, the free lunch could be an adventure. An adventure best undertaken with a very strong stomach and a healthy dose of skepticism. Stories abound of saloon owners serving up suspiciously old meat, disguising it with heavy spices, or simply hoping that enough whiskey would numb the taste buds of their patrons into submission. Let's gently transition from the freebies to the paid offerings. Because while the free lunch was a draw, people did actually pay for food in saloons. Especially if they were tired of pickled everything or just needed something more substantial to soak up the copious amounts of alcohol. The most common paid meal was probably a simple stew or chili. These were perfect for a saloon environment. They could be made in large batches, kept warm over a low flame for hours, and were relatively forgiving when it came to ingredients. You could throw in whatever meat was available, beef, venison, even rabbit if things were tough, along with some beans, onions, and whatever spices were on hand. It was hearty, it was filling, and it was usually cheap. And let's be honest, a good, robust chili could mask a multitude of sins. If the meat wasn't exactly prime cut, or if it had been sitting around a bit too long, a generous amount of chili powder and other seasonings could make it palatable. Or at least, make it seem palatable after a few shots of Rotgut whiskey. Moving on from the questionable mystery of the free lunch, chili, we should probably talk about the bread. Now, in our modern world, we think of bread as this fluffy, artisanal delight, perhaps with a nice crust and a hint of sourdough. In a frontier saloon, bread was more of a structural commitment. It was often what they called hardtack, or hardtack, which is essentially a biscuit that has lost all its will to live. It was made of flour, water, and occasionally salt, baked until it was hard enough to survive a journey across the Mojave Desert without molding. To eat it, you didn't just bite into it, unless you were looking to give the local frontier dentist some business. No, you had to soak it. You'd drop your slab of hardtack into your stew or your coffee and wait. And wait. Eventually, it would soften into a sort of pale, gelatinous mush that you could swallow. It wasn't exactly a culinary highlight, but it was calories, and when you're leaning against a bar in 1875, calories are king. The curious case of the Prairie oyster. Let's drift over to something a bit more adventurous. If you were in a particularly upscale saloon, and by upscale, I mean they occasionally swept the sawdust off the floor, you might encounter the Hangtown Fry. This was a dish born of the California Gold Rush, specifically in a town called Hangtown, now known as Placerville. The story goes that a lucky miner walked into a saloon with a bag of gold nuggets and demanded the most expensive meal the house could provide. At the time, the two most expensive ingredients available were eggs and oysters. Eggs had to be hauled carefully over mountain passes, and oysters were shipped in tins or even packed in ice all the way from the coast. The result was a fried omelet with oysters and bacon. It was the ultimate "I've struck it rich" meal. But for every miner eating a Hangtown Fry, there were 1,000 guys eating Prairie oysters. Now, if you aren't familiar with the term, a Prairie oyster isn't an oyster. It doesn't come from the sea. It comes from a bull. Specifically, it's the testicles. Because on the frontier, nothing went to waste, partly out of respect for the animal, but mostly because food was scarce and people were hungry. They'd be peeled, sliced, breaded, and fried. They were actually considered a bit of a delicacy in some circles, often served with a side of dry humor and a very strong drink to help the realization of what you were eating go down a little smoother. And speaking of things that shouldn't be called what they were, we have to talk about the son of a bitch stew. That's the actual name. It's a very descriptive, very Wild West name for a dish that used every leftover bit of a slaughtered calf. We're talking heart, liver, brains, and the lights, which is just a polite way of saying lungs. Everything went into the pot. It was simmered for hours until it reached a consistency that can only be described as thick. The name supposedly came from the fact that it was a dish usually served at the end of a long cattle drive when the supplies were low and the cook was grumpy. It was a son of a bitch to prepare, and probably a son of a bitch to digest, but it kept the Cowboys from starving. It's the kind of meal that makes you appreciate your modern refrigerator. The liquid diet and the Rotgut reality. Of course, we can't talk about saloon food without talking about what people were drinking to wash it down. The beer was rarely cold. This is an important detail for the atmosphere. Imagine a lukewarm, cloudy liquid that had probably been sitting in a wooden barrel for a few weeks too long. It was often called needle beer, because some unscrupulous owners would spike it with needles to give it a bit of a kick, or more commonly, skunky beer, because of the temperature. But the whiskey, oh, the whiskey. In the movies, it's always a smooth, amber liquid poured from a clean glass bottle. In reality, it was often something called Rotgut, and it earned that name. To stretch their supply, saloon keepers would take a small amount of actual whiskey and cut it with all sorts of delightful additives. We're talking about tobacco spit for color, strychnine for a buzz, or even turpentine and gunpowder. It was less of a beverage and more of a chemical experiment. When a cowboy walked in and asked for the good stuff, he was usually just asking for the bottle that didn't have a dead fly floating in it. They had names for these concoctions like snake oil, coffin, varnish, or firewater. You didn't sip this. You knocked it back as quickly as possible to avoid letting it linger on your taste buds, and then you probably ate a very salty piece of ham from the free lunch table just to kill the chemical aftertaste. It's a wonder anyone survived the night, let alone a whole decade on the frontier. The digestive systems of the 19th century must have been made of cast iron. The desert of the Old West. If you survived the main course and the turpentine-laced whiskey, you might be looking for something sweet. But sugar was a luxury. Most saloons didn't really do dessert. If you were lucky, there might be some dried fruit, apples or peaches that had shriveled up until they resembled leather. You'd chew on these for a while, a slow, rhythmic process that was probably quite meditative if you didn't think too hard about how long they'd been sitting in that jar. Sometimes, a saloon might have a vinegar pie. Yes, you heard that right. When lemons weren't available, which was almost always, cooks would use apple cider vinegar to provide that acidic tang in a custard pie. It's surprisingly edible, a sort of poor man's lemon meringue, but it speaks to the desperation for a bit of variety in a world dominated by brown stew and gray bread. As we sit here in the quiet of the present, it's easy to look back on these menus with a bit of a shiver. But there's a strange, slow comfort in imagining those dimly lit rooms, the smell of the wood smoke, and the simple, repetitive nature of the meals. It was a hard life, a dusty life, but it was a life where a warm bowl of beans and a piece of bread you'd soaked for 20 minutes could feel like the height of luxury. Would you like me to continue the journey into the specific, bizarre dining habits of the most famous outlaws, or perhaps move on to the strange etiquette of the saloon table? Let's drift a little further into the corner of the saloon, away from the bar and toward those shaky wooden tables. Because if you think the food was questionable, the etiquette, or the complete lack thereof, was its own kind of slow-motion disaster. The etiquette of the unwashed. In a modern restaurant, we have rules about elbows on the table or which fork to use for the salad. In a 1880s saloon, the main rule was essentially, don't touch another man's plate unless you're prepared to see a doctor. It was a very quiet, very tense sort of dining experience. Most men ate with their hats on, tilted low over their eyes, partly because there was nowhere else to put them, but mostly because it helped you focus on the task at hand, which was getting the calories into your system before someone started a disagreement over a game of faro. There's a certain rhythmic quality to the way they ate. The scraping of a dull knife against a tin plate. The slow, heavy slurp of coffee that was more chicory and mud than actual bean. It wasn't a social event, it was a refueling. You didn't talk with your mouth full, not out of politeness, but because the food was usually so dry you needed every bit of saliva just to get it down. And then there was the communal towel. Oh, the communal towel. Many saloons had a long, damp cloth hanging from the bar. It was there for everyone. You'd eat your greasy chili, wipe your hands on the towel, and then the next guy would do the same. It was a masterpiece of bacterial sharing. If you were a germaphobe in the Old West, you didn't stay a germaphobe for long. You either adapted or you simply stopped existing. The outlaw's appetite. Now, let's float over to some of the more famous faces of the era. You'd think that men like Jesse James or Billy the Kid would have had some grand, cinematic preference for food. But really, they were just as stuck with the saloon menu as everyone else. Billy the Kid, for instance, was known to be quite fond of chili Colorado. He spent a lot of time in New Mexico, where the food actually had a bit of flavor thanks to the local peppers. But even a legendary outlaw has to eat what's available. There are records of Billy sitting down to a meal of simple eggs and tortillas just before a narrow escape. It's a very grounding thought, isn't it? A man with a price on his head, calmly peeling a hard-boiled egg while the law closes in. No rush, just the slow, methodical movement of someone who knows that a hungry man can't outrun a posse. Then you have the Earp brothers in Tombstone. Now, Tombstone was a bit fancy for a silver mining camp. They actually had ice. They had restaurants that tried to mimic the menus of San Francisco. You could get a steak that wasn't strictly used as a boot sole. But even there, the sleepless historian, irony holds true. Wyatt Earp, the man of the OK Corral, was famously a teetotaler later in life and had a very delicate stomach. He preferred ice cream. Imagine this formidable lawman, known for his steely gaze and quick draw, sitting in a parlor quietly eating a bowl of vanilla ice cream while the town buzzed with talk of the next stagecoach robbery. It's a wonderfully flat, humanizing image. The canned revolution. As the 1800s began to crawl toward the 1900s, things changed. We started to see the arrival of the tin can. This was the peak of technological advancement for the saloon chef. Suddenly, you didn't have to worry if the beef in the stew was actually beef. It said so right on the label. Canned peaches became the ultimate luxury. They were sweet, they were soft, and they didn't require you to soak them in coffee for an hour. If a saloon had canned peaches, it was basically a Michelin-starred establishment. Men would pay a day's wages just to sit and eat the syrup out of the bottom of the tin. It was a slow, sugary indulgence in a life that was otherwise very bitter. And we can't forget the oysters. I mentioned them before, but the obsession with tinned oysters in the middle of a desert is truly bizarre. Archaeologists digging up old saloon sites don't find many gold coins. They find thousands and thousands of oyster tins. It was the fancy food of the era. You're in a dusty, windswept town in Nevada, 1,000 miles from the ocean, and you're eating tinned oysters that have been sitting on a shelf for 3 years. It's a miracle anyone's digestive tract didn't just give up entirely. The final sip. As the night grows deeper and the saloon doors in our minds finally stop swinging, we're left with a very quiet realization. The Wild West wasn't just built on silver and gold. It was built on beans, salted pork, and a whole lot of iron-willed stomachs. The next time you have a meal that's a little bit cold or a little bit bland, just remember the man in 1880 sitting at a scarred wooden table, soaking his hardtack in a bowl of son-of-a-bitch stew, washing it down with a glass of coffin varnish, and thinking to himself, "This isn't half bad." The lights are low now. The dust has settled on the bar. The piano player has finally gone home, and even the free lunch pickles have been put away for the night. It's time for us to drift off, too. Would you like me to continue by exploring the bizarre medical cures people used after eating this food, or shall we move on to the strange sleeping arrangements in the boarding houses above these saloons? Since we've survived the meal and the coffin varnish, whiskey, it's only natural that our bodies might start to protest. In the 1880s, a stomach ache wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was a philosophical dilemma. If the food didn't get you, the medicine surely would. So let's drift upstairs, past the creaking floorboards of the saloon, and look into the strange, sleepy world of frontier health, and the even stranger places where people laid their heads. The medicine cabinet of horrors. If you woke up the morning after a saloon feast feeling like a herd of buffalo had stampeded over your midsection, you didn't go to a pharmacy. You went back to the saloon or the general store and looked for a patent medicine. These were beautifully labeled bottles filled with hope, or more accurately, filled with a mix of alcohol, opium, and occasionally a splash of mercury. Because why not? The tone of these remedies was always so confident. They promised to cure everything from dyspepsia to general melancholy. And they usually worked, in a sense. If you drink a bottle that is 40% grain alcohol and 10% liquid opium, you're not going to care about your indigestion anymore. You're not going to care about anything. You'll just drift into a hazy, dreamless state while your internal organs wonder what they did to deserve this. One of the more popular cures for a rough night was a glass of water mixed with a bit of baking soda and a dash of something called Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound. It was marketed to women, but plenty of cowboys took it on the sly. It was basically a herbal tincture that tasted like a forest floor, but it provided a moment of calm in a very chaotic digestive reality. Then there were the blue mass pills. These were little balls of mercury mixed with rose water and honey. Abraham Lincoln famously took them for his melancholy. They didn't really help the sadness, but they did lead to mercury poisoning, which includes symptoms like irritability and tremors. So, you'd go into the saloon feeling a bit bloated and come out 3 weeks later with a permanent twitch and a sudden desire to argue with a cactus. It was a slow, rhythmic decline into madness, disguised as a health regimen. The 6-inch mattress and the shared bed. Now, let's talk about where these folks actually slept after their questionable dinner and their mercury pills. If you weren't sleeping under the stars with your head on a saddle, which, let's be honest, was probably more hygienic, you were staying in a boarding house or the hotel rooms above the saloon. Space was at a premium. Privacy was a concept that hadn't quite made it past the Mississippi River yet. In many places, you didn't rent a room, you rented a spot. This often meant a bundle bed, a pile of straw, or a very thin, lumpy mattress stuffed with corn husks. As you shifted in the night, the husks would crinkle and crunch, a rhythmic, rustling soundtrack to your uneasy dreams of pickled eggs. But the real charm was double-decking. This didn't mean bunk beds. It meant you were sharing a bed with a complete stranger. You'd pay your 50 cents, climb into a bed that already contained a snoring miner or a dusty ranch hand, and hope for the best. The etiquette here was very specific. You slept, spoon fashion, to maximize space, and when the man at the end of the line wanted to turn over, he'd yell, "Spoon!" and everyone in the bed would flip at the same time. It was a slow, synchronized dance of unwashed bodies. You try not to think about the fact that your bedmate hadn't seen a bathtub since the previous 4th of July. You just close your eyes, listen to the muffled sounds of the piano downstairs, and drift off into a sleep that was probably more of a temporary coma. The luxury of the bathhouse. Every once in a while, a traveler would decide they'd had enough of the communal aroma. This is when they'd seek out a bath. In a mining town, a bath was an event. It wasn't something you did in the privacy of your own home. You went to a barber shop or a dedicated bathhouse. For about 25 cents, you got a tub of warm water. But here's the catch. You weren't necessarily the first person in that water. Or the second. Or the fifth. The water was changed only when it became thick enough to support the weight of a dropped bar of soap. It was a slow, murky soup of frontier grime. By the time the 10th person climbed in, the bath was more of a mud treatment. But people did it anyway, because there was a certain psychological comfort in being clean, even if you were just swapping your own dirt for someone else's. You dry off with a towel that was only slightly less damp than the one at the saloon bar, put your dusty clothes back on, and feel like a brand new man. It was a modest, quiet victory over the elements. The quiet hum of the frontier night. As we wind down our journey, think about the sheer stillness of those nights. No sirens, no humming refrigerators, no glowing screens. Just the wind whistling through the gaps in the wooden siding, the distant howl of a coyote, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of 10 strangers in a shared bed. The Wild West was a place of extreme discomfort, but there was a simplicity to it that we've lost. Life was reduced to the basics. Find something to eat that won't kill you immediately. Find a place to sleep where you won't get stepped on, and maybe, if you're lucky, find a bottle of medicine that makes the whole thing feel like a hazy, distant dream. The dust is thick on the floor, the lanterns have all flickered out, and the only sound left is the slow, steady pulse of history. We've traveled from the salty, free lunch, to the shared beds of the boarding house, and now, it's time to finally let the silence take over. Would you like me to go deeper into the strange personal grooming habits of the era, or perhaps move on to the bizarre fashion choices of the dandies who tried to bring high style to the dusty trails? Since we've managed to get ourselves somewhat clean in that communal bathwater, and we've survived a night in the spoon fashion beds, we should probably look at what these people did to maintain appearances. Because even in a world of dust and mercury pills, human vanity remained remarkably persistent. Let's drift into the world of frontier grooming, a place where style was often a desperate battle against the elements. The barber's chair and the rusty blade. The barber's shop was the sanctuary of the Wild West. It was the one place where a man could sit down, close his eyes, and let someone else take charge of his dignity for 20 minutes. But like everything else in the 1880s, it was a bit of a gamble. The barber was often the town's unofficial surgeon and dentist as well. If the pole outside had red stripes, it wasn't just for decoration, it represented the bloody bandages from his other jobs. You'd sit in a heavy wooden chair, your head tilted back, and watch the barber strop a straight razor on a piece of leather. It's a very slow, rhythmic sound. Slap. 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 The shaving cream was usually just a harsh fly soap that smelled faintly of animal fat and pine. He'd lather it on with a brush made of badger hair, or, if the town was particularly remote, maybe just a clump of horsehair that felt like scrubbing your face with a pinecone. Then came the blade. You had to stay perfectly still. If the piano player downstairs hit a particularly jarring note and the barber flinched, you weren't just getting a trim, you were getting a permanent souvenir. But the reward was the bay rum. After the shave, they'd splash this concoction on your face. It was a mix of bay leaves, cloves, and you guessed it, more high-proof alcohol. It burned like a prairie fire, but for a few minutes you smelled like a tropical spice merchant instead of a wet horse. It was the ultimate frontier luxury. The magnificent, dusty mustache. Of course, we have to talk about the facial hair. In the late 19th century, a clean-shaven face was often seen as a sign of a man who had too much time on his hands or perhaps something to hide. Most men opted for the full landscape approach. We're talking about handlebar mustaches so long they required their own zip code, and beards that acted as a secondary filtration system for saloon dust. The maintenance of a truly epic mustache was a slow, dedicated process. They had mustache wax, which was often just beeswax mixed with a bit of soot for color. You'd twirl the ends into sharp points, creating a look that said, "I am a man of substance, even if I haven't changed my socks in 3 weeks." The problem, as you can imagine, was the soup. Remember that son of a bitch stew we talked about? Imagine trying to navigate a spoonful of greasy broth through a thicket of waxed hair. This led to the invention of the mustache spoon and the mustache cup, special ceramic mugs with a little bridge across the top to keep your facial hair dry while you sipped your coffee. It was a very delicate, very slow way to drink. One wrong move and your carefully sculpted points would go limp, leaving you looking less like a rugged lawman and more like a sad, wet walrus. Hair oil and the dandies. And then we have the hair on top of the head. Since baths were rare, hair tended to get, let's call it, sculptural. To manage the grease, they didn't wash it, they added more grease. Macassar oil was the favorite. It was a thick, fragrant oil that made your hair shine like a new nickel and stay exactly where you put it, even in a gale-force wind. This is why you'll see antimacassars in old photos, those little lace doilies on the backs of chairs. They weren't just for decoration, they were there to keep the gentleman's hair oil from ruining the upholstery. It was a constant battle between the desire to look slick and the reality of the grime. Now, every town had at least one dandy. This was a man who tried to bring the fashion of New York or London to the middle of a cattle trail. He'd wear a silk waistcoat, a string tie, and maybe even a bowler hat. He was an ironic contrast to the world around him. While everyone else was dressed in shades of dirt and more dirt, the dandy would stroll down the boardwalk in a checkered suit, looking like a lost character from a light opera. People tolerated the dandy, mostly because he provided a bit of visual variety. But his life was a slow-motion struggle. Keeping a white shirt white in a town where the primary industry was coal mining or cattle driving was a full-time job. He'd spend his evenings meticulously brushing dust off his lapels with a small wooden brush, a rhythmic, repetitive motion that probably kept him sane while he dreamed of a world with paved streets and actual napkins. The fragrance of the frontier. As we close this chapter on grooming, let's take a deep, metaphorical breath. What did the Wild West actually smell like? If we're being honest, and we always are here, it was a complex bouquet. It was a base note of unwashed wool and wood smoke, with a heart of stale beer and horse manure, topped with a sharp, stinging note of bay rum and lye soap. It wasn't good, but it was consistent. It was the smell of 1,000 people all engaged in the same slow, quiet struggle to stay human in a place that wanted to turn them into dust. The barber has put away his razor. The last dandy has finished brushing his coat and has gone to bed in his shared spoon mattress. The mustache wax has hardened for the night. Everything is still, everything is quiet, and the only thing moving is the moon reflecting off a discarded bottle of Macassar oil in the street. Would you like me to continue by exploring the bizarre world of frontier entertainment, the traveling circuses and the tragic, failed theater troupes? Or shall we wander over to the strange pets and animals that shared these saloons with the outlaws? Since we've groomed our mustaches to a razor-sharp point and managed to avoid a mercury-induced meltdown, we might find ourselves looking for a bit of a distraction. In a world where the most exciting thing that happened on Tuesday was a cow getting stuck in a fence, people were desperate for culture. But culture, in the 1880s, was a loose term. It usually involved a traveling troupe of exhausted actors or a circus that had seen better decades. Let's drift into the dimly lit world of frontier entertainment, the strange, the tragic, and the accidentally hilarious. The tragedians and the tinned tomatoes. Imagine you're a classically trained Shakespearian actor. You've performed in London, maybe even New York. And now, through a series of increasingly poor life choices, you find yourself on a makeshift stage in a mining camp, illuminated by flickering kerosene lamps that smell like burned hair. You're trying to deliver Hamlet's soliloquy, but the audience consists mostly of miners who haven't seen a woman in 6 months and who are currently more interested in their bowls of son-of-a-bitch stew than your existential crisis. The relationship between the performers and the audience was interactive. If the crowd didn't like your rendition of Macbeth, they wouldn't just write a bad review. They'd throw things. And since fresh fruit was a luxury, they'd throw what they had, empty tin cans, rocks, or if they really hated you, pieces of that rock-hard saloon bread we talked about. There are records of actors having to duck behind wooden crates during particularly moving speeches. It was a slow, rhythmic game of dodgeball played with high-stakes drama. But if they did like you, that was almost worse. They'd demand encore after encore. You'd finish the play at midnight, and they'd make you start the whole thing over. There's something deeply ironic about a group of rugged, gun-toting outlaws weeping openly at a third-rate performance of Romeo and Juliet, then going out and getting into a shootout over a poker game 10 minutes later. It was a world of sharp, jagged emotional contrasts. The traveling menagerie of sadness. Then there were the circuses. These weren't the grand spectacles of the 20th century. These were menageries, usually a couple of wagons pulled by skeletal horses, containing a very tired lion and maybe a bear that had forgotten how to be a bear. The highlight was often the elephant. Except, because hauling an elephant across the desert was a logistical nightmare, it was often just a very large horse covered in a gray tarp with a stuffed trunk attached to its face. If you didn't look too closely, and remember, everyone was drinking coffin varnish, it almost worked. People would stand in line for hours, paying their hard-earned silver to stare at a disguised farm animal. It was a slow, quiet exercise in collective imagination. They wanted to believe in something exotic, even if the exotic smelled suspiciously like the local livery stable. There was also the strongman. He was usually just a guy named Dave who could lift a heavy barrel of flour. He'd stand there in leopard print tights, which were probably just dyed long johns, and flex his muscles while the town's dandy looked on with quiet envy. It was a simple, honest kind of entertainment. No special effects, no loud music, just Dave and his flour barrel, doing his best to convince everyone that life was more than just dust and beans. The saloon pets. If the traveling circus didn't make it to town, the saloon itself often provided its own animal entertainment. It wasn't uncommon for a saloon to have a mascot. But because this was the Wild West, these weren't golden retrievers. We're talking about pet badgers, tamed coyotes, or even the occasional bear cub that someone had found in the mountains and brought back as a joke. These animals lived on a diet of saloon scraps and occasionally beer. Yes, the history of the frontier is littered with stories of drunk animals. There was a famous bear in a New Mexico saloon that learned how to open beer bottles with its teeth. People would travel for miles just to watch a 400-pound predator get tipsy and fall asleep behind the piano. It's a wonderfully absurd, slightly terrifying image, a room full of outlaws, a cloud of tobacco smoke, and a snoring bear in the corner. It provided a sense of companionship in a very lonely landscape. For a miner who spent 14 hours a day in a dark hole in the ground, petting a grumpy badger while sipping lukewarm ale was the closest he got to a domestic life. It was a slow, rhythmic bonding between man and beast, united by the fact that they were both probably a little bit confused about how they ended up there. The melancholy of the piano player. And in the background of all of this was the music. The professor, as the piano player was often called, was the heartbeat of the saloon. He usually wasn't a professor of anything, of course. He was just a guy who knew 4 songs and could play them for 10 hours straight without stopping. The piano was almost always out of tune. The dry desert air did terrible things to the wooden frames and the strings. So every song had a slightly haunted, dissonant quality, a slow, jangly soundtrack to the frontier night. The professor would sit there, a cigarette dangling from his lip, his eyes half closed, playing Home! Sweet Home! For the 500th time that week. It wasn't about the skill, it was about the noise. It filled the silence of the vast, empty prairie. It made the saloon feel like a bubble of civilization in a sea of nothingness. As long as the professor was playing, the world made sense. But when the music stopped, usually because a fight had broken out or the piano had finally given up the ghost, the silence that rushed back and was heavy and cold. It reminded everyone that they were just small, fragile things in a very big, very indifferent world. The lanterns are dimming now. The professor has closed the lid on the out-of-tune piano. The pet bear is curled up in a corner, dreaming of mountains, and Dave the strong man has finally put down his flour barrel. The actors have packed their tin tomato-dented costumes and moved on to the next camp. Everything is settling. The dust is reclaiming the floor. The irony of it all, the Shakespeare in the dirt, the horse elephants, the drunk bears, it all fades into a gentle, rhythmic hum. Would you like me to continue by exploring the strange, lonely lives of the women who worked in these saloons? Or shall we move on to the bizarre superstitions and ghost stories the miners told to pass the long, dark nights? Since the circus wagons have rattled off into the darkness and that professor has finally rested his weary fingers, the saloon feels a little hollow. The silence that fills the room is heavy, the kind that makes you lean back and wonder about the shadows in the corners. In a place where death was a frequent, uninvited guest, people tended to fill the void with some truly bizarre beliefs. So let's drift into the flickering candlelight of the boarding house and explore the strange superstitions and ghost stories that kept the frontier from feeling too empty. The atomic knockers, and the silent deep. If you were a miner in the 1880s, your world didn't end at the saloon door. It extended deep into the earth, into tunnels that were dark, damp, and smelled of sulfur and old sweat. And down there, in the quiet between the rhythmic thud of the pickaxe, you weren't alone. Or at least, you hoped you weren't. The miners brought with them the legend of the atomic knockers. These were supposed to be small, mischievous spirits, often the ghosts of miners who had perished in cave-ins. They weren't necessarily malevolent. They were more like supernatural foremen. They tap on the rock walls, knock, 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 to warn the men of an impending collapse. It was a slow, creepy sort of comfort. You'd be sitting there, eating your pasty, a heavy meat pie, in the dim light of a tallow candle stuck to your hat, and you'd hear a faint tapping. You didn't question it. You didn't look for a logical explanation. You just slowly packed your tools and headed for the surface. Because in the deep earth, logic didn't keep you alive, but a polite relationship with a ghost did. To keep the atomic knockers happy, miners would leave the last bite of their lunch on a ledge. It was a rhythmic sacrifice, one bite for the man, one bite for the mountain. If you forgot, well, don't be surprised if your shovel went missing or your candle flickered out at the exact wrong moment. The superstitions of the card table. Back at the saloon, the superstitions were less about survival and more about the desperate hope of turning a nickel into a dollar. Gambling wasn't just a game, it was a ritual. And rituals require rules that don't always make sense. For instance, you never, ever count your chips while sitting at the table. It was seen as an insult to the gods of luck, a double down on your own arrogance. You waited until the game was over, or until you were broke, which was the more common outcome. Then there was the dead man's hand. We all know the story of Wild Bill Hickok, who was shot in Deadwood while holding a pair of aces and a pair of eights. After that, holding those cards wasn't just bad luck, it was a psychological weight. You'd see a man's face go pale as he looked at his hand, his thumb tracing the edge of the card in a slow, nervous circle. He wouldn't fold immediately, that would be cowardly, but he'd play with a certain heavy resignation, as if he could already feel the cold wind of the afterlife on his neck. And then there were the chairs. If a man got up from a winning streak, nobody would sit in his chair for at least 10 minutes. They believed the luck had to settle, like dust after a stagecoach passes. If you sat down too quickly, you'd scare the luck away. It's a wonderfully flat, quiet way to look at the world, treating fortune like a skittish animal that might bolt if you make too much noise. The ghostly riders of the plain. Outside the town limits, where the desert stretched out like a vast, gray ocean under the moon, the stories got even stranger. Cowboys, despite their rugged reputation, were incredibly prone to seeing things that weren't there. When you spend 18 hours a day on a horse, staring at the rhythmic swaying of a cow's tail, your brain starts to play tricks on you. They spoke of the phantom stampede, a sound of thundering hooves that would approach in the middle of a dead-still night, only to vanish right as it reached the camp. There were no cows, no dust, just the fading echo of 1,000 ghost steers. The cowboys would sit by the fire, their coffee long gone cold, and listen. They wouldn't reach for their guns. They'd just pull their blankets a little tighter. It was a reminder that the West was old, far older than the fences and the railroads, and that it had a memory that didn't include them. There's a certain irony in it. These men were conquerors of the wilderness, yet they were terrified of a breeze that sounded too much like a human whistle. They lived in a world of sharp, violent reality, but they navigated it using a map of whispers and old wives' tales. It was their way of making sense of the vastness, a slow, rhythmic attempt to put a name to the nameless fear of the dark. The final superstition, the empty glass. As we return to the saloon one last time tonight, we see the most persistent superstition of all, the tribute drink. It was common for a group of friends to buy a round and leave one glass full on the bar for a companion who had gone up the trail, a polite way of saying they died. The bartender wouldn't touch it. The other patrons would give it a wide berth. It would just sit there, the amber whiskey reflecting the dying light of the lamps, a silent, liquid monument to a life that had flickered out. Eventually, the alcohol would evaporate, leaving a sticky, dark ring on the wood. It was a slow, quiet disappearing act. It's a fitting image to end on. A world built on grand ambitions and violent deeds, reduced to a single, untouched glass of Rotgut, whiskey sitting in the dust. The ghosts don't scream in the Wild West. They just wait for the light to fade, for the professor to stop playing, and for the last man to stagger out into the cool, silent night. The atomic knockers have stopped their tapping. The ghost steers have moved on to greener, more ethereal pastures. The cards have been shuffled and put away, and the dead man's hand is just a story told to keep the tourists awake. The lights are almost gone now. The fire in the stove is nothing but glowing embers. It's time to let history breathe, to let the dust settle, and to finally, quietly drift off. Would you like me to finish our journey by describing the slow, inevitable, ghost town phase of these saloons, or shall we pivot to the strange, lonely lives of the frontier postmasters who were the only link to the outside world? As the embers in the saloon stove fade from a bright orange to a dull, sleepy crimson, we should probably talk about the end of the road. Because for every bustling town like Tombstone or Dodge City, there were 100 little camps that simply stopped. They didn't go out in a blaze of glory or a cinematic shootout. They just ran out of luck, ran out of silver, or simply forgot why they were there in the first place. This is the slow, silent transition into the ghost town phase, the final, quiet sigh of the frontier. The architecture of abandonment. Imagine a saloon that was once the heartbeat of a community. The brass rail was polished every morning, the air was thick with the scent of tobacco, and the rhythmic clinking of glasses. Now, the doors have lost their spring. They don't swing, they just hang, creaking occasionally when the wind catches them. The most ironic thing about a ghost town saloon is how much was left behind. When the mine dried up, people didn't have moving vans. They had horses and small wagons. You couldn't take the heavy mahogany bar with you. You couldn't take the piano. So, these grand, expensive objects were simply left to the dust. There's a strange, slow beauty in seeing a piano in the middle of a desert, its keys warped by the sun and its strings snap like brittle hair. It becomes a skeletal version of itself. A coyote might wander in and find a scrap of that hard track, bread tucked behind a floorboard, still perfectly preserved, still as inedible as it was in 1882. The desert is a great preserver of mistakes. It doesn't judge the son of a bitch stew or the coffin varnish. It just covers them in a thin, rhythmic layer of sand until they become part of the landscape. The lone postmaster. But before a town completely died, it usually had one last resident, the postmaster. This was often the loneliest job in the West. He sat in a small wooden shack, surrounded by cubbyholes that were increasingly empty. The postmaster was the bridge between the dusty reality of the saloon and this civilized world back east. He handled the letters from mothers asking why their sons hadn't written, and the Sears Roebuck catalogs that promised a world of lace curtains and velvet sofas, things that felt like science fiction in a town where the primary decoration was a collection of empty oyster tins. He would wait for the stagecoach, a slow, rumbling arrival that happened maybe once a week. The rhythmic sound of the hooves was the only thing that kept him tethered to the concept of time. When the stagecoach finally stopped coming because there were no more letters to deliver, the postmaster would pack his one small trunk, lock the door, which was a bit optimistic, and walk away. He was the one who turned out the lights on the dream. The silence of the silver. In the end, the Wild West wasn't a movie. It was a collection of very tired people eating very bad food and drinking things that should have been used to strip paint. It was a place of ironic contrasts. The dandy with his hair oil sitting next to the miner with his tonic knocker superstitions. The professor, playing Mozart on a piano that sounded like a bag of nails. As we settle into the deepest part of the night, we can almost hear the phantom sounds of that era. Not the gunshots, but the small things. The scrape of a chair on a wooden floor. The hiss of a kerosene lamp. The slow, heavy breath of a man who has just finished a bowl of beans and is looking at the moon, wondering if tomorrow will be the day he finally strikes it rich. The history of the frontier is a long, meandering monologue of human persistence. It's a story of people who were sick, tired, and probably had a permanent stomach ache, but who kept moving forward anyway. The lamps have flickered out. The mahogany bar is cold. The dust has finally stopped dancing in the light and has settled into its final resting place. The Wild West is asleep now, tucked under a blanket of stars and silver-gray sand. A final drift. Close your eyes. Feel the weight of the silence, the same silence that settled over those saloons a century ago. The stories are all told. The whiskey is gone. The free lunch is just a memory. You are safe, you are warm, and you are far away from the Rotgut and the Mercury pills. Let the rhythm of the old world carry you off. The trail ends here, and the rest is just the quiet, steady hum of the desert night. Good night, everyone. Sleep well.